Welcome back to Minds Matter, a podcast sponsored by the Monash Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. I'm Beth.
And I'm Ava. And on Minds Matter, we explore research from neuroscience to psychology while occasionally talking through our own personal experiences.
And this week on the podcast, I spoke to Dr. Isabella Bower, who is a postdoc at the University of South Australia. And she does really cool research on how the built environment can affect our mental health. This is probably something that we think about or we feel when we're in different rooms, but her work actually looks at, okay, what's going on? How are people feeling? What's going on in the brain when we're in these different environments? And how can we measure this? Because this feels like there's lots of variables going on. When we're in built environments, how can we design studies that test these ideas? So I think this is a really cool episode. It's cool to think about how we can design our own homes and offices and spaces to improve mental health. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoy.
My name's Bella, and I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of South Australia. I have a different background in that I started off in architecture. My idea with architecture was it could make quite a big difference because it's our living environments, it's really shaping the world as well. So I went into architecture. I did a Bachelor of Design at Deakin and then a master's degree at Melbourne Uni. And even then, I had a few friends who were enrolled in science classes and I grabbed their science textbook. Sometimes I even went into their lectures and I felt like an imposter there. I still couldn't see any way that I'd get back to that. It was just like a nice little side thing. Towards the end of my master's degree, though, I started struggling with seeing where I'd go in architecture. So I really quite liked hospital design and school design because I thought hospital design people were in quite a vulnerable state. And then for school design, you've got these developing minds too. So potentially the built environment makes more of an impact in these two. So I started trying to make all of the things I did in the end of my master's degree to do with healthcare. So again, you can see that science a little bit coming back there. But I finished that degree still not knowing that a PhD existed. It was only a few years after working as a research assistant that I was like, oh, you need a PhD to be able to put in for your own grants. I wanted to start winning money to be able to do my own projects. So that was really where that PhD came from. But while I was in the architecture world, my first job in architecture was actually working for, and it was an amazing first job, working for the Victorian Government Architects Office. So I was working as a research assistant. I was looking at learning environment and hospital design at Melbourne University, and I took the chance working as a research assistant, not really understanding what that meant at all or how to conduct research. I'd even say we just didn't do research training in architecture school at all. I didn't have the exposure I wish I did now, seeing how psychology students are trained. I did a lot of government consultancies, working with the Department of Education and Training, working with a hospital authority. So looking at how to design those spaces, but not quantitative work. And I was really interested in the psychological side of things. And basically, I put in an application for what ended up being a PhD project. I say I put it in. I got so close to putting it in, but then I got declined to put it in at the last stage because I didn't have the background behind me from the faculty that I worked in architecture. And that was tough. And at that point, I was like, I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to go get a PhD myself then if I can't even put in this grant application without a PhD. And so I went back to Deakin, only because that's where I did my undergraduate degrees in architecture. And I knew a great professor who had always encouraged me when I was back there. And he said, look, whatever you want to do, I'll support you. I have no experience in this, but I'll support you. And that's all I was looking for at the time. And so I went into that PhD with him. I knew I had to find someone in psychology still. And I just had a few meetings, and one of them was with Pete Entercott from Deakin, and he seemed great. He said, yeah, I'll take you on. I'll co-supervise you. So that was fantastic.
I love that. And I feel like building that community is so important too, because then you just get information that you might not get. You understand like how these things work, because otherwise it can be very confusing and overwhelming. So I think, like going to the courses, speaking to the professors, joining the clubs actually helps so much.
it's like extra data points as well, just on your experience too, so you can understand how you're tracking compared to other people and what's normal and what's not, because otherwise you wouldn't know in the PhD. And when I did start the PhD, I was still working for Melbourne Uni, but I changed jobs and worked as a research outputs coordinator. And I sat with the head of the graduate researchers. So she looked after all the architecture PhDs. And from that, it was also quite a good experience of normalising what to expect in the PhD as well. I felt like I had this extra insight and I was like, okay, I don't think I'm going well, but actually in the scheme of things, I think I am doing okay. And that was a nice checkpoint too.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I love these non-traditional journeys.
Non-linear trajectories, definitely non-linear.
So your research looks at brain functioning and mental health through the built environment. Can you explain why this is important? And is this a big area of research?
I think it's interesting that with the built environment, we think a lot about the physical side and we have guidelines for the physical side of things to make sure we don't fall and hurt ourselves. Though that being said, there's a lot of physical barriers in the built environment still, and we're getting closer with universal design now, of that being quite a big prominent area of going, we need to make sure we have design practitioners who have a whole range of diversity and experiences behind them so they know how to design urban spaces and interior spaces that work for everyone. As soon as you hurt yourself and you have to navigate a city, you realise how difficult it can be still. But that's the side that should be easier to understand because you can see it and it's a physical thing. But the psychological side of things, that's tough. It's like we don't see it, and so therefore does it get forgotten a little bit. When I started doing that coursework, they showed us all the animals research as well, and I was like, wow, we know so much about environmental enrichment in mice. Why don't we know that much in humans as well? And I get that we can control a lot of the things in the environment for mice, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, I'd love to do an experiment that does tease those things apart and is really controlled in that manner. I think there's more research in this area overseas than there is in Australia, and I think that comes back to probably our education system and curriculum. When I came through, there wasn't courses on environmental psychology. So there's really environmental neuroscience from that kind of more biological side, and then environmental psychology. But speaking to my colleagues that had gone through in the 70s, they did have that offered to them. So it was interesting it disappeared from the architecture curriculum in Australia, and I'm not sure why. I think that's affected how much research is happening in Australia because there's not enough visibility to do that research. Yes, certainly there is more and more happening overseas. UCL in London, they spent heaps of money building this huge big centre. It's called the Pearl Place, and it's like this big warehouse space where you can control and change all these variables, like amazing. And then in America, there's the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, which is trying to bring together practitioners and researchers. I'd say it's still very practitioner heavy and not enough research. And it's interesting, practitioners are so keen, and I get that there's timelines and buildings have to keep on getting built, but I don't think that we have enough to translate with complete confidence yet. We're still building this up from the start. So yeah, it's getting there. I think it's still an emerging field of research though.
What are some things, the built environment, it feels, I'm just looking around the room now, has a million things, but what are some elements of the built environment that might affect our mental health?
So when I went into the PhD, I wanted to strip out as many variables as possible, and we could have a whole philosophical discussion about the built environment that I did test at the end of the day. Perhaps I should explain what I brought it down to, and then how complex I actually think it really is, and then the ways to test that from like basic through to the really applied side, which I'm trying to do the spectrum of at the moment. So also, when I went to Deakin, I knew they had a facility called a cave automatic virtual environment. You've got these projector screens, and so it's a more immersive form of virtual reality. You don't have a headset on, but you can feel that physical weight on your head as well. And so you get to stand or sit or move in the middle of this big space, and you can change the environment. And it was no natural light in that lab. It was all black, and I could measure the temperature inside, the air velocity, the humidity. I could try and remove those variables because I think comfort and, how hot or cold we feel in the environment, that might affect us before the colours of the walls might affect us. And so I really wanted to make sure that I'd measured and tried to exclude all of those elements out of my experiment first. But then also, well, is it a room with a window? And I didn't want a window because then what's out the window? What's that view? Same with a doorway. So I had a door and I used the Australian standards. So it's like a handbook of how big and small everything should be for human proportions. And I used that for like an interior wooden door. And that was my kind of control of how big a door should be. I also put a chair in the room so you had a depth cue. So it was literally just a white room that had a doorway with a closed door and a chair in the corner. That was it. That was all I displayed while I was controlling the temperature and those other variables within the space. And I popped participants in there for 2 minutes. They were just sitting there and they're just staring. They didn't do any tasks, and at the end of that 2 minutes, they'd do a self-report on how they felt about their emotions. I was quite interested in understanding if the physiological response that we saw in the EEG and autonomic activity matched what people could tell us about their emotions. Because at the moment, to evaluate buildings, we very much do a post-occupancy evaluation and say, how was that experience? Does that building work for you? And I just wasn't sure, like, how good are people at articulating how that is affecting them. So that was a very controlled experiment. But the other things to keep in mind is context. Is that a hospital room? Is it a school classroom? How's that going to affect you? What happens if you prime people as well beforehand? We all have memories of the built environments too. And so what if you've been bullied in that space before and then you come back and you have that association? And I'm still really interested in that. Can we prime and then extinguish those effects? And you might think of applied examples of that where you walk through city areas at night and they're crime hotspots, and perhaps those that have been assaulted in those spaces, will they always fear that space, or can we extinguish that? Is it a good thing to extinguish that? Same with domestic violence. It's quite interesting how that will all come into play. So there's context, then there's always other people within the space too, and so that's going to affect your experience too, and how comfortable you feel with those other people around. In terms of the design characteristics, I broke it down to colour, geometry, texture, and scale. And I just was interested in scale and colour. I didn't test the geometry or texture, but in a way, did I? Because it was a square room. There was still, like, when I created the virtual model, there was a bit of texture to make the walls look like plaster, because you had to get that equal. It was this balancing act between making it look like a room, but not, if you made it too pure of what you were testing, it didn't look like a room anymore, especially with the colour one where we changed the wall colour to blue originally. We'll just go pure blue. And I did that and it looked like a mermaid's room. And I was like, that's not anyone's experience of a blue room. So I went on to a kind of like number one paint manufacturer that has the most sales in Australia, and I looked at what their most popular shade of blue was. I'm like, okay, well, we use that. It's not perfect because it's got different saturation and hue and lightness to it. It's not a stable blue in that sense, but it is one that's more realistic to have experienced. And so I think I'm testing what I want to test with it. But there's so many compromises with those choices that you make and the limitations that come about from it.
Do you have to worry about if people felt claustrophobic? Because I get really claustrophobic, and if I was in a room without a window, I would be like, get me out, get me out.
I think the good thing with the cave was it didn't have a ceiling to it. So it was just 3 walls, and it didn't have a back wall to it. But certainly you would probably feel as a participant, I think I would feel when I was testing it myself, you're being observed by at least one person behind you. So that's not too natural. And there's no natural light or way out of that space. The first time I collected data was pre-COVID, so that was one thing. But the second time, it was just after all of those Melbourne lockdowns as well that we'd been through, and I was wearing a full mask on, and it seems very clinical. And I always try with participants to get them at ease beforehand and explain everything in advance that I'm able to explain, and make it as similar as possible experience for everyone. A lot of my participants were first timers as well. They'd never been involved in research before. And so then it's even more important. You want them to have an amazing experience, so they do more research as well. They always did walk away, as far as I know, when I asked them afterwards, they really did enjoy the experience and they didn't feel uncomfortable. But I think you probably see it a little bit where you have people that are knee jitterers as well, and you're like, ooh. And at the same time, I'm thinking, oh no, how's that going to affect my artifacts in my EEG record?
So maybe, so I can see if it didn't have the roof, then I probably would be okay.
And you're not fully enclosed,
You're
like
not
you don't have a
trapped.
back wall on it. I think they have actually got the extra panel to put a back wall on it. I think that would be really tough. But also then you wouldn't be able to monitor properly. And I feel, it's really important that you can monitor how that participant's going from behind, just to make sure they know what they're doing and they're paying attention and they're not falling asleep. If they are falling asleep, you want to take a note of that.
Cool. So in this study that you've been explaining, what did you find? What were the things that affected how people were feeling?
Yeah, so we were looking at emotion, and so we were wanting to compare our results with studies that had looked at positive and negative emotion in a very simple sense of it as well. And it was my first time using EEG and autonomic measures. What we found, which was exploratory finding, so it wasn't what we went in to find, but when we just broke down the power analysis of the EEG, we noticed that when participants were just sitting in the space and they're in the enlarged space, so those bigger rooms, we saw high frequency brain activity, which we'd usually associate with concentration. And we thought that was an interesting finding in that we didn't expect them to have to concentrate too hard in that space. Like, a very basic room. They were just sitting there. They didn't have to do a task at all. And it led to the follow-up question of, when we're in these enlarged spaces, does it actually have a detrimental effect on our performance then? Does that mean that because we're already hyper-vigilant maybe about being in that big space, does that mean that we might perform a little bit worse at a task requiring concentration? Could be the opposite, but I had gone in thinking it might be that we perform a little bit worse if we're using some of the capacity we have. And it could be a threat thing within the environment. Again, not too sure. So that was the scale side of things. The other one was colour. And broadly, that one we found it was linked with the positive emotional state. It was good that it was the same type of brain activity we'd expect with emotion, whereas for scale, it absolutely wasn't. It was something to do with that kind of emotion literature. We couldn't tie it to that at all. But it was also a smallish sample. It was only 18 participants. Interestingly, because it was the same participant pool as well, that there was more of an effect with colour than there was with scale. It came out quite strongly, even with less participants. With scale, we had 66. Whereas with colour we only had 18, and that was actually a result of trying to put through ethics at the last minute to do an amendment to actually add colour to it. But it was still great. We got 18 through at the end of it. So they had experienced scale, and then they had that extra colour condition. It wasn't randomised in that sense. Scale was nice in that we could randomise it. It was the main variable. But with that, it was an extra tack on of the coloured room right at the end. But yeah, it was interesting to see that difference. The other part of it was the self-report. We didn't see an association between the self-report and what was coming out in the autonomic and EEG measures. And look, maybe that's just that the way we do the self-report isn't sensitive enough. We use that self-assessment mannequin, like the little pictorial scale of pleasure, arousal, dominance. And because those words probably for first-timers in the psychology sense aren't the most clear as well, I'd explain feeling quite dull and bored, feeling really jittery. Or otherwise, maybe we just aren't that aware of our surrounds too. Could be that. Yeah.
So with the colour, am I right? You tested blue?
Yes.
And so blue made people feel more positive emotions. Is that right?
From the brain activity that we were seeing, yes, like we were seeing the right side, the lateralization in the brain, we were seeing it in alpha theta, that like the areas that we'd expect it and the areas that we'd expect it for positive emotion. But that said, it's so difficult, right? Because we're comparing it to studies that are showing people photos of sunsets and photos of happy kittens and going, is that happy compared to being in a blue room as well? I think more work needs to be done in that sense too. And also, who knows what would happen if that person had a really bad experience in a blue room beforehand. So when I have engaged with media about those findings too, I always just put so many disclaimers on it as well, in that it's still too basic research. I don't think it can be applied yet because we need to bring in all the complexity that comes with being in an actual blue room.
You're probably aware of this, but I have read the literature on nature and mental health, and apparently blue spaces, so like oceans and lakes, have better impact on our mental health than green spaces. So they're all good for us, but blue space, and I don't think they really know why that is,
Yep.
but there's some research suggesting that. So that's what I thought when I was thinking of the blue room.
Yeah, I was seeing that research too. And I still am really quite interested in the natural spaces. It's just the complexity that comes with all the
Yeah.
plant varieties and what's the weather doing.
And with the scale finding, that's really interesting because if I think about most libraries I go to, they're really big rooms with, you probably know the State Library in
Yep.
Melbourne. It's so beautiful. I love it. But it's really large and big. And I always feel that helps me think. But I guess what you found is maybe suggesting something different.
But it might be also that priming of why you're going into the space and what you're doing within the space as well. That could be affecting you too. Yeah, it would be quite interesting to prime people first or give them a task that they have to do. Potentially, if they're just doing a reflective task, is that helpful? But if they're doing something that's an assessment that's would that have a different effect? And having that evidence to unpick that would be quite.
How could we apply these findings to our own lives, to the own, if we were to build a house or a hospital, do we know yet what things we should think about, or is there anything? Yeah, what would your advice be?
My advice would be at this stage, if the evidence isn't there, consider how you think that the environment is affecting you and then move to spaces that might work better or for you for the type of task you need to do. So I'm trying to move towards the idea that there's never going to be like this one perfect, like a golden rule of what an ideal built environment is, because it depends on the person, it depends on what they need to do within the space. I think it'd be really cool considering in the future perhaps that how in hospital environments, those that deal with radiation, they wear those little kind of tags on them as well to see how much exposure they've had to something bad. Be quite interesting to consider built environments like that, where you move to different spaces depending on what type of task you need to do. And I really love considering the ethical components of all of this in the future, and that interplay also with climate change and the emissions that kind of go into constructing the built environment too. If we found a building had a bad effect on everyone, would you just knock it down and build something new, or would you keep it and just limit someone's exposure to it as well? Then there's also those environments where you might not be able to move, like in a hospital environment, but in a prison, in childcare, there's going to be a lot of spaces where you won't have autonomy to be able to pick up and go, oh, this isn't working for me.
Yeah.
But what if it was having a negative impact on your health, so much so that it was causing you to need medication or doing some sort of damage to you? Who's actually responsible for that? And is that the World Health Organization? But what level of responsibility does that fall? Yeah, I think the ethical side of this into the future is quite interesting as we develop the evidence base. Because my blue sky thinking is that one day, apart from the physical design guidelines, we'll actually have the psychological design guidelines, and it will be recommendations on the colour and the size of the room for inpatient treatment centres and things like that. And we will know what those effects are going to be on people. I don't think that's coming soon, but that's a long-term vision of what we might have.
And it's okay if you don't know the answer to this, or if there isn't really that research there. But are there studies showing people in certain environments it has a really negative impact on them? Have we made that link yet? Or is it more these kind of things that you're explaining? There's some evidence suggesting this, some suggesting that. Has there been a big study that's shown, oh, this room made everyone feel terrible, or?
Yeah, the best examples that are coming to my mind at the moment, probably those awful historical examples where people have been forced into spaces like prisons without windows. And I think in some of those studies, they've found that the brain just then, there's no light, there's nothing, so there's no visual cues whatsoever. And the brain starts creating its own new kind of realities. And yeah, so I think there's some interesting stuff from that side. There's also, I think, studies in orphanages as well, with kids growing up in those spaces too. there is some stuff. Obviously, for ethics reasons, we would never do those studies anymore. But from those awful historical cases, I think it is demonstrating the importance of the environment there.
Because for me, I would think the most important thing I feel that I always need, and I guess most people feel that way, but again, maybe not everyone because we don't know, but a room has a lot of light, natural light. That's like affects, I feel like that probably affects me the most if I'm thinking about what affects me.
Yeah. I started working on a project too with some sleep researchers only because I ended up in an area where there's heaps of people that really love sleep. And I was like, oh, I hadn't really thought about sleep, but we spend the most time sleeping in the built environment. So I wonder how that affects us. And we did a little bit of a review looking at, not a published one, it was part of an honours project, but we were looking at what within the built environment might affect sleep quality as well. And so, yes, absolutely noise. There was a lot of those indoor environmental quality factors. There wasn't that much research out there on the colour of the walls or things like that, but it would be interesting to know that side of things too. And that really came out because I visited a sleep lab, and each of the patient rooms that they had, they changed the colour of the doors and the tags within them and the artwork.
Oh, wow.
One was red, one was blue, one was purple. And I'm like, oh, have you ever thought that could be affecting your participants and your data?
Oh, that's so interesting. And then, and again, this also might be pop science gone awry, but is it true that like red rooms make you angry? Is it true that orange, is all that true, or is that just...
I think I was going to be interviewed and I looked up this study. There was a pink effect. I think it came from this Stanford prison experiment where they changed the colour of those holding bays. They tried to replicate it and it didn't replicate. So I guess I'd go with that for now, that it didn't replicate. But I think when I was looking through that original study, I was like, oh, it wasn't. There were different time periods where they had their participants as well. And I was just a little bit skeptical about it. And having not seen it replicated yet, I'd say that one probably hasn't stood up.
I feel this is, whenever we get anyone on, the answer is, it's really complicated.
Yeah, that's science, right?
That's what it's like. I guess in the end, no surprises there.
Yeah. I do think we make progress. Every little step helps, and every study does help us get that needle a little bit further of understanding and pulling apart some of that complexity as well. Yeah.
So I think a lot about individual differences and experiences in terms of mental health and precision psychiatry and all of that kind of stuff. But I hadn't thought of something. And I don't know why. I was like, built environment the impact must be the same on everyone. And I didn't make the connection that, even though it's something that I really think about a lot in my work, I just had assumed that a beautiful room was a beautiful room.
Yeah.
But of course, it would be so different depending on so many different things. And I hadn't thought of that is so different for everyone. So that, I don't know, I love always being reminded that we should always go out the world remembering that everything is very different for everybody.
Yeah, and different across different stages of the lifespan, different in how we process things. Especially with colour, you need to make sure that you don't have colourblind participants, because that's definitely you'd assume that would be a very different experience for them as well. But the sensory sensitivity stuff is interesting too, and looking into how people that might be extra sensitive could be affected more or less by the environment. Yeah, I agree. It just is so important, and it's tough at the start of studies as well, where you try to set down these limitations and go, right, I want to exclude the temperature, I want to exclude all of these things, and you're missing the diversity that you need in your sample population too. So I'm trying to get that more and more in, because my original studies work that traditional psychology science of like 18 to 40, healthy adults, no underlying mental health conditions. And as a result, you're like, yeah, but is this the effect that it has on absolutely everyone? Because the built environment is for everyone, it should be for everyone. And it will be interesting too if there's different effects for different people. Who do you design it for?
Yeah.
Do you design for a majority, or do you just make sure that there's a variety of spaces that'll work for all the different people? So I think it's that complex, and it'll be having options for people. But ideally, even if you could change things about your environment too. I was originally thinking with the scale thing, if we were finding an impact there, what do you do in office spaces? If someone needs to all of a sudden concentrate on doing a report, do you have these barriers that pop up that kind of surround you that make it easier for you to concentrate on that? But then they can pop down again because perhaps you're in a flight control center and you need to be able to collaborate with other people as well.
Mhm.
And yeah, building in some of that flexibility of how you could change it for the different types of tasks you need to do could be interesting.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I guess you do see more and more now at university campuses, having more rooms if you're feeling overwhelmed or if you need to go somewhere where there's less going on. I feel like that's becoming more common, which is really good.
Yeah, definitely. Even in school design, I feel there's more of those different spaces popping up and having little nooks away from the main crowded areas too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's really good. This has been amazing and so interesting. And now at least I know I don't need to go and paint my whole house blue.
You can run a study on it, a bit of data.
Ava, top things in a space for you.
Oh my God. Wow, put me on the spot. I used to think that space didn't matter to me.
Really?
Yeah, because I also this is like a difference between my partner and I, which is that I can have clutter all around and be totally fine. And if something was messy, I feel like it doesn't impact my mental health. Whereas I know that definitely for my partner, like whenever we clean, when he finally gets me to pick up after myself, like I can hear him breathe and he's like, "Don't you feel so much better?" And I'm like, "I feel nothing." So I feel like for a while I thought, oh, it doesn't really matter. But I think maybe this is getting deep, but I think it was also because I was like distracting myself a lot. Did I tell you I was trying to do my 75 soft challenge, Beth?
I don't know what 75 soft is.
On the internet, there's 75 hard.
I don't even know what that is.
Okay. There's no reason I'm sure like no one will know what that is, but basically the 75 hard challenge is you have to work out twice a day for 45 minutes and then read a nonfiction book and drink a lot of water and like all this stuff. And then
Who,
the internet
who started
girlies,
that?
I don't know, some guy, because it's very
Okay.
like, and the internet girlies basically made like a 75 soft, which is just you choose your own thing, but you try to do it for 75 days. So I was like, okay, new year, new me. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try to do this. So for like 20 days, I didn't, we're on day 50 and she's long gone. But I was like, I was meditating in the morning. I was journaling.
What?
I was working out. I know. Who is she?
You didn't tell me this.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's been like 30 days since I stopped doing that when I started having my breakdowns. Every day I'm like, Beth, I'm dying.
Yeah, I was like, wait, when's the meditating happening?
Yeah, it's been a while. But in those 30 days, no, but really, within 5 days, because I feel like I'm always listening to something or watching something or like always very stimulated. And I feel like in those days I was like, oh, I feel like my environment is really influencing me. And then I was like, oh, I could feel shifts in how I felt depending on where I was. But I feel like I was really blocking that out because I was bombarding myself with so much other signal, which is how I feel now. And the other thing about space that I started working in a new lab space a few months ago. And I feel like I've been so much more productive in that lab. And everyone who comes to our lab, you've been there, Beth, is like, this lab is so nice. And I feel like everyone feels like it's really cozy and productive. And I do think there's something to the space itself. And I think it's that we can see a little crack of the outdoors because at UCSB, there's no windows in any of our labs, but we're right next to the doors. You can kind of see the outdoors and it's very open. Also our advisor stuck fake plants onto like little decals. So I think that helps. So I think like some color, open space, and like people. But that's not really part of built environment. That's my space.
I have a few things to say. Should you go back to your Should you go back to the 75 soft then? Maybe.
I think I should, but I've been pretty stressed over the last. Like the thing is, I had all these good intentions, as you do in January, and then I just started slipping. But I've kept working out. And also the thing is, the routine would take me like 3 hours for some reason. I would wake up at like 6:30 or 7, and then it would be like 11. But I will go back to it. But maybe it's good that I don't feel influenced by my environment.
I don't know.
No.
I feel like having constant other stimulation might not be good, but
No, that's not good.
yeah.
No. But I could be anywhere.
I could be anywhere where it happens.
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like you're very particular about your environment.
I am a big space
Yeah.
environment person, but I am messy, as we
Yeah.
know.
Yes.
But I do really care about what space I'm in. So for me, natural light, this is going to sound so basic, but I really love natural light. I like to be able to look at a tree. That's really important. And I
Yeah.
have lots of plants in my room and lots of art, lots of plants, lots of art. And everywhere I've been able to make my own, I always have lots of plants and art and color. And if I don't have natural light, I always make sure I go outside and not look directly at the sun, but
Oh my gosh, we're basically doing like a Huberman Lab podcast now. Like getting sunlight, get your plants, tree
yeah,
nearby.
sorry everyone. So those are important to me. And as a sensitive soul, places that I don't like, I'm like, I feel sick. I can be very dramatic about it.
Like just the physical space?
Yeah. So I go to a lot of different labs,
Yeah.
and I went to a lab, and one of the rooms it had to be windowless and it was made of metal. And I was like, I cannot even look at this. I don't feel okay. Then they were like, okay, that's like an extreme reaction. But
Okay. Okay.
you know how Isabella was speaking about it's not really clear what room is good for some people
Yeah.
because it's all different. I was like, oh, I definitely, for some reason, some spaces I like completely freak out.
Interesting.
Yeah. I'm also
I've only,
claustrophobic.
yeah, I was gonna say I've only seen people really freak out about a space when I put people in MRI.
I,
Like some
yeah,
participants are like they're totally fine, and then they're like, "Get me out!" And then it's been 1 minute, and they're like wet from sweat.
yes,
That's the only time that I've ever seen a built environment freak someone out. But
that would be me.
yeah, it's not the best. I think also though, and it seemed like what I got from the episode was there's things that might be good in general for people, but also I guess like everything else, you have to figure out what works for you.
Yeah.
And I feel like you're very in tune with what you're feeling, and I don't think that I am. So I think that's why in spaces I'm just kind of like, oh, whatever. But then I do think when I step back, I'm like, oh, like there are like emotional feelings that I have towards spaces that I don't realize in the moment. But then if I kind of think about them when I'm not there, I think I have a more automatic emotional association because like I feel like my house is really cozy and like I love being in
Yeah,
my
your
house.
house is cozy.
Yeah, because
I
I
love
think it's
being in your
cozy.
house.
Yeah, I think our house is cozy. And I think
Yeah.
a big part of it is because we have the trees outside.
Yeah. And you've
Because
got
I've
that
been to,
couch,
yeah, we do have our couch.
the window, and then all the trees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the window, I think, because the tree kind of makes a little like a little painting.
Yeah. It
And
does.
I've seen other people's houses like similar units, and if they're on like the first floor, like they don't have the tree outside, it's way sadder.
Yeah.
So I do think there are things like that, but I think I'm not as in tune to them. But maybe they make a bigger impact than you realize.
I
Yeah.
feel like that was also some of Isabella's research was showing that the self-report sometimes didn't reflect really what people
Yeah.
were experiencing. So it did seem like it was affecting it more than people actually realized.
Yeah. I always feel like that's tricky because it's like if you're not feeling it, what impact does it have? And I feel like we don't have a good metric of that because we don't do enough like longitudinal studies.
Yeah.
And I feel the same. Like I wear my little wearable and it'll be like, you're dying today. I'm like, I feel great. So on the edge of your life today.
Slow down, slow down.
I'm like, everything's fine.
But I suppose if you don't feel like it's affecting you, it could be affecting the way you process information, and that might
That's
not
true.
come up in a feeling, but that changes decision making, learning, that kind of stuff.
It's true. But I think it also, when you were talking about scale, And you were like, oh, I
Yeah.
feel like I would do better in a large room.
Yeah.
I feel that I would also do better in a large room, but then it's because I feel like I don't have a good grasp on myself. I'm like, what if I think something and then that's completely wrong? Then what am I supposed to do? The only thing I can do is get Bella to test me.
Because the other thing is, and this is just speculating, and Bella might be like, no, Beth, that's so wrong. But in those big spaces, because we do feel more hypervigilant, I do wonder if then certain systems are turned up more that make new information. Could some new information easier to learn?
I mean, I do think it's very specific to the activity that you're doing.
Yeah. I
I
can't
think
work outside. Can you work outside?
if I had a proper table, I think I could.
Yeah, okay.
And I think it's hard to work outside because our screens are like,
You can't see.
you can't see anything, especially in that Australian sun.
Yeah, so you're just being blinded. Would you like to just finish by letting us know what you're excited about, what's coming up next?
Yeah. So I finished my PhD. I'd done these really controlled studies and I was like, what's next? I was very lucky in that I secured this fellowship where they didn't even put me down on a project. They're just like, you do you for the next 5 years. And that's also really intimidating too, because I'd just come out of the PhD. I was trying to learn how to be an independent researcher and then it's go do projects. One of the things that's most important to me is not building this career of findings in the PhD that may not replicate. So I wanted to make sure that what happened in virtual reality also happens in physical space too. And it's really ambitious and I'm still hoping that it'll all come through. I got my ethics through. I purchased all the equipment to do it, but it's actually finding the physical space to do it. I'm trying to construct those virtual rooms. You need a really big space to be able to do that as well. So that's the kind of physical limitation of it. I'm trying to construct that experiment now so they're actually physically in the space to see that what happens in virtual reality happens in the physical built environment too. So I'm really excited about that. I'm excited about trying to build these huge big wall panels and see how that goes. It's like the real nice crossover between architecture and then the science of the experiment that will happen too. But I'm also really excited collaborating with more people. So I've started going into the education space and also the legal context too, of understanding how contexts like courtroom design might be affecting certain people, like judges' decision making. So there's some really cool applications of this research that can come about from it. So I'm just hoping overall that I can expand the different populations I work with, the complexity of going from that basic research into more applied contexts as well, and seeing where things go from there.
Thank you to Dr. Isabella Bower for joining us this episode. Our intro and outro music is Nobody Stayed for the DJ by Glacio. Our transition music is Back for More, also by Glacio. Minds Matter is mixed, edited, and created by Beth Fisher, she's the Australian one, and me, Ava Madasouza. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode, but in the meantime, find all our episodes and show notes on mindsmatterpodcast.com.